But we'll talk more about this refinery on the second half of the show. But let's get to our first conversation. We'll continue our conversation on the proposed budget presented by President Bola Tinubu for the 2024 fiscal year. The proposed budget for 2024 is estimated at 27.5 trillion naira. That's more than what we had before now, with an oil price benchmark of $77 per barrel and currency value of 750 naira per dollar, with a target of 3.75% GDP growth and a 1.4% inflation rate. The president stated that the government will set aside 8.25 trillion naira for debt service, with a large target of 18 trillion naira, and as for revenue. To discuss this and other issues around the 2024 appropriation bill, I'm being joined by Professor Uche Walike. He is a professor of capital market and also the president of the Association of Capital Market Academics of Nigeria. Thank you, Prof. It's really good to have you this Friday afternoon.
Thanks so much, Tolu, for inviting me.
Now, Prof, the normal thing when we want to talk about budgeting first would be maybe an overview of the document itself. But I want us to look at the assumptions. That is where I want us to, the projections for crude output, the pegging our dollar to naira exchange rate at 750 naira, targeting inflation for 21.4%. Growth rate is also targeted to go higher. What is your understanding of all of this, and how achievable, or how do you think we can achieve all of this? If not 100%, 80 to 90%.
Yeah, thanks so much, Tolu. Tolu, before I speak to that, I need to lend my voice to the call by the former CBN governor, for a proper audit of the NNPC Limited. I was at that event yesterday, the event organized by the Bank Directors Association of Nigeria, where the former CBN governor made that call. And I couldn't but agree, with him that there is need to have the NNPC, properly audited, particularly so when we are talking about eventually getting the company listed on the exchange. We can't have the process, to be seamlessly implemented if the NNPC is not, first of all, cleaned up. So that has to happen before we can talk about bringing the NNPC, to getting it listed and having it do an initial public offering. I must also say that I'm also in alignment with his view that it's time we had another, person functioning as a substantive minister for petroleum. The president is too busy, to also, add that responsibility, himself. Now, having said that, with respect to the assumptions and benchmarks of the 2024 budget, one way to look at that or assess the level of or its likelihood of being attained is even to look at the 23, the ones we had in 2023, and the extent to which they have performed. If you look at the 2023 budget, for example, you find that of all the parameters of the assumptions, the one that appeared favorable or recorded favorable balance, is just the oil price. Oil price for 2023 budget was $75 per barrel. On the average, we understand between January and September, it has done $81 per barrel. So that's just where we it would appear we have recorded favorable variance. With respect to the other ones, it's been a case of adverse variances. Whether you're talking in terms of the oil production for 2023 was, I think, 1.69 barrels per day. On the average between January and September, from the reports, the minimum expenditure framework, we understand is what they have done is just about 1.33 million barrels per day, which is, of course, below what was projected in the budget. Inflation rate of 17% in 2023. What do we have today? The last inflation, test inflation figure is 27.3%. You also have exchange rate. Exchange rate in 2023 was 435 naira to the dollar. On the average between January and September, the report says exchange rate has been around 609 naira to the dollar on the average between January and September. Again, that's a case of adverse variance. If you also look at the GDP projection for 2023, to 3.75% GDP growth rate for 2023, what do we have today? The latest we have from the National Bureau of Statistics for quarter 3 of 2023 is 2.54%. Again, that's a case of adverse variance. So it's against this backdrop that you also view that of 2024. For 2024, I would also say the oil price appears realistic, considering the fact that oil price, remember what they have used there is $77.9 per barrel. And that's when you're looking at projections by reputable energy agencies, by the U.S. Energy Information Administration, for example. If you look at their short-term energy outlook, it's talking about $93 per barrel. If you also look at what some other countries have used for their fiscal year 2023-24, Saudi Arabia, for example, has used $80 per barrel as its break-even oil price. Egypt, $80 per barrel. So if you take all of that into consideration, it stands to reason that the $77.9 per barrel, appears, realistic. The production for 2024, 1.78 million barrels per day. If you look at what we have done so far over the years, at least in recent times, it will seem to be little on the high side. But I'm optimistic that we are likely to see some improvements or inching very close to that, especially so that now we are beginning to record improvements in dealing with the crude oil theft. Oil production has steadily improved to, I understand, around 1.5 million barrels per day now. So there is the likelihood that before the end of next year, we are likely to get inch towards the 1.78 million barrels per day. But the other parameters, assumptions, talking about the inflation rate of 21.4, the GDP growth rate of 3.76%, and exchange rate of 750. As for me, those ones are they don't seem realistic. Particularly the exchange rate, and you notice that they are all connected. You see, because the exchange rate is not likely to turn, come in at 750 on the average for 2024. You're also likely to see a dislocation in the inflation rate. Inflation rate is also likely to be higher because exchange rate is likely to be higher. And of course, all of that too will eventually translate to lower output, lower GDP growth projection. By the way, the IMF has projected growth rate of 2.9% for Nigeria for 2024, and we are anticipating 3.76%. So for me, the major challenge will remain the exchange rate of 750 naira to the dollar, and that's because for now, as you know, we are now using the single window, the Nigerian foreign exchange market. If it were before, when we had official and another rate for other transactions, you could say yes, for planning purposes, the 750 will stand. But because we are using just one single exchange rate window, it's pretty difficult to attain, and that will also affect inflation. That will also affect our GDP growth projection.
Beautiful stuff there, Prof. We run a budget with a deficit budget, and of course, debt service still remains very high. Of course, many will say Nigeria will still have to borrow to fund this budget, despite all plans to generate monies internally. Taiwo is working on tax reforms. We're supposed to get some monies from fuel subsidy removal. Government not paying subsidy anymore. What do you make of revenue aspirations or revenue projections of government and, of course, this debt aspect of this budget?
All right. Of course, you know that when we talk about revenue, you're looking at both oil revenue and non-oil revenue. I think oil revenue is being projected at about 7 trillion or thereabout. The total revenue of about 18 trillion, of course, is largely going to come from non-oil revenue and then other sources. All right. And I want to believe the government is relying on the fact that the outcome of the work of the Presidential Committee on Fiscal Policy and Tax Reforms will rub off positively on the revenue side, and we're likely to see more coming in, from the non-oil side. Now, the oil revenue side, of course, is a function of the price and the output. Okay, part of why you find that deficits, appeared reduced compared to 2023 is because of the fact that the exchange rate was actually jacked up. Okay, when you jack up exchange rate, it also has the effect of increasing the naira inflows that you're likely to have. If you increase the exchange rate today, the one in the budget from 750 to 800, of course, the naira again revenue will increase, and that should also go to further narrow the deficit. Initially, you remember in the MTEF, the former MTEF, it was what they used then was 700 naira to the dollar, and the deficit appeared wider. But with the 750 exchange rate, the deficit reduced about 9.8 trillion, which is what we have now. Now, how does the government intend to finance the deficit? Largely through borrowing. Very, very little is coming in from by way of privatization proceeds. If you check 2024, what they have provided there is just about 250 billion for privatization, which is very infinitesimal. The bulk of it is still through borrowing, whether new borrowing or the drawdowns they want to do, from multilateral and bilateral, sources. But new borrowings in that projection is over 7 trillion. I think 7.8 trillion. New borrowing, and out of the new borrowing of 7.8 trillion, unlike the previous years where they were evenly divided between domestic sources and external sources, the domestic component alone is about 78% of the total. That's about 6.2 trillion. Okay, so if government is going to borrow 6.8 trillion, from the domestic economy, as opposed to previous years, as I said on April division, one should also expect that for 2024, the interest rate environment is likely to be, high, because as the government is borrowing from the domestic economy, two effects. It has the way of crowding out the private sector. It also has the effect of driving up, interest rates, which is why I doubt very much the GDP growth projection of 3.76%, because if interest rates are going up in the economy, with the central bank again changing stance, further tightening monetary policy, you should also expect that output, is likely to suffer. So, but what is important is that, of course, deficit has to be financed. What is important is that when we are borrowing, we use the right instruments. By that I mean we borrow, such that proceeds from the loans are ring-fenced and are tied to projects, especially when they are self-liquidating. Now, I say this because of our current debt stock, profile. If you look at our current debt stock, again, data from the Debt Management Office, you will find that our domestic debt is around 48 trillion naira. Total debt stock is put at over 87 trillion. The domestic component is about 48 trillion. Now, if you also disaggregate that domestic component by instruments, that is how they have been raised, okay? That will also give you a sense of the use to which they have been put. you realize that FGM bonds accounted for over 86% of that of the instruments I'm talking about, and that's worrisome. That's worrisome because the real infrastructure bonds there, namely the Sukuk and the green bonds, represent less than 2%. Okay, so what it means is that in the past we have just borrowed without really tying them to infrastructure. And when you borrow for recurrent, when you borrow for consumption, okay, the result is it's usually inflationary, all right, and you should also expect that unemployment will be on the rise. So I'm saying that for 2024, fiscal year, the best approach will be to ensure that those domestic borrowings will be done using the right instrument. And when I say right instrument, I'm talking about infrastructure bonds. I'm talking about Sukuk, for example. I'm talking about green bonds, of course, for sustainability. All right. So when you use the right instruments to borrow, okay, it saves you the risk even of increased debt service, because part of why we've had this huge debt service burden, all right, is because we have not borrowed, we have not really applied the loans, to self-liquidating projects. So you have the problem of paying back. Okay, so the point must be made. If you look at the 2024 budget again, debt service to revenue, was put at I think 45%, and I'm saying even if we're able to achieve that, some people say it's high, but even if we're able to achieve that, that will represent a major improvement over what we have had in previous years. Okay, a situation in which we spend as much as 80%, 90% of revenue just to service debt is unacceptable. So if you can even do 45%, that's fine. The 2024 budget has a deficit component of 3.88% to GDP, which again is an improvement over the actual we've had in 2023 of 6.11%. Okay, and one way we can ensure that deficit is reduced, we can move towards fiscal consolidation, is to ensure that we, of course, ramp up revenue. And if we are spending, we also spend right. If we are borrowing, we borrow right. By borrowing right, I mean use the right instruments to borrow. When we're also borrowing externally, the much that has been allocated for external, we should also not lean so much on the commercial debt. We should also not lean so much on euro bonds, again, which in my view has also been a mistake over the years. Leaning so much on euro bonds, very expensive euro bonds that have come with a discretionary feature. Okay, when you issue euro bonds, the process again are not tied to infrastructure. But when we borrow from multilateral institutions, from the World Bank, for example, you are sure that much of it will go into visible projects, or even some bilateral loans that are also tied to projects. So for me, the approach is very important, and that's the only way we can really develop as a country. If you look at the capital components of the budget, okay, about 8.7 trillion capital component. But if you again look at the details of the budget, you will find that much of that too is non-developmental, because it's not just, look, you're not just interested in the figure for capital. The question is, how much of the capital budget is developmental budget? A situation in which you find a lot of it going to purchase of cars, purchase of furniture. Those are capital, they're under capital items, but they don't really represent the developmental capital. So our attention in budgeting, should be what are we applying to developmental capital? What are we applying to infrastructure? Okay, fiscal infrastructure, whether roads, power, again, whether social infrastructure, health, education. That is where development, lies and comes from, and not just in, consumption spending.
I must thank you so much, Prof. That's much time can take, but thanks for your analysis and understanding of this very important document. Professor Uche Waleke is a professor of capital markets, and he's also the president of the Association of Capital Market Academics of Nigeria. Do have a great weekend. We appreciate your time as usual.
Thank you so much, Tolu.